Imagine a courtroom where the tension is thick. The judge leans forward, the lawyers shuffle their papers nervously, and the entire audience waits for the next move. In that moment, Judge Jackson does something unexpected. She mocks Senator Kennedy not once, not twice, but 4 separate times. Each remark sharper than the last, each cutting through the formality of the court like a knife. And while everyone laughs or gasps at her quick wit, nobody could have predicted what came next, because Kennedy's final response didn't just silence the room. It stunned the court and flipped the entire exchange on its head. This wasn't just about 2 public figures trading words. This was about power perception and the fine line between confidence and overconfidence. Judge Jackson, known for her intelligence and razor-sharp questioning, had been commanding the room. Kennedy, often underestimated, was cornered, and in those moments it seemed like the outcome was decided. But then came his response, steady, measured, and striking in its delivery. Why did this matter? Because exchanges like these don't stay inside courtrooms. They travel beyond walls, they become viral, and they shape the way we see leaders. They reveal more about character than 1,000 press releases ever could. One remark, one comeback can shift the balance of perception overnight. So, let me ask you, when a judge mocks a senator 4 times, is the senator doomed to humiliation, or can a single moment of composure turn mockery into respect? That's what we're about to uncover. We will walk through exactly what happened in that courtroom. We will break down each mock, why it landed, and how it set the stage for what felt like Kennedy's defeat. And then we will see how his final words flipped the script, leaving the entire room stunned. This is not just courtroom drama. This is a lesson in strategy, communication, and how power shifts in the blink of an eye. Whether you admire Judge Jackson or Kennedy, there's something here that demands attention. Because in that courtroom, we didn't just witness an argument, we witnessed a clash of minds, and when the dust settled, nobody could deny the outcome was unforgettable. So, stay with me, because once you hear how Kennedy turned mockery into a stunning finish, you'll see why this moment is being replayed everywhere, and why it will be remembered for years to come. To understand why this courtroom exchange carried so much weight, we need to step back. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has built a reputation as a sharp, deliberate, and highly respected legal mind. From her years on the federal bench to her confirmation as the first Black woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, every moment of her career has been closely watched. She's known for her direct questioning style, respectful, yes, but also probing in ways that make witnesses and lawmakers alike think twice before responding casually. Senator John Kennedy, on the other hand, is no stranger to high-pressure exchanges. A seasoned politician with a reputation for wit, humor, and pointed remarks, Kennedy often uses his Southern charm to disarm opponents. While some see him as unfiltered, others admire his ability to simplify complex issues into plain, relatable language. Whether in the Senate chambers or during media appearances, Kennedy rarely shies away from a tough moment. Now, place these 2 figures in the same courtroom setting, and you can already imagine the tension. It wasn't the first time a judge and a senator had crossed paths in a high-profile way, but this moment was different. The stakes were higher, and the personalities stronger. The lead-up to the exchange began with discussions surrounding constitutional interpretation, legal precedents, and how the judiciary should balance tradition with modern realities. Judge Jackson pressed Kennedy with sharp questions, sometimes framing them in ways that drew laughter or murmurs from the courtroom. Her style in this instance wasn't just about clarification. It leaned toward humor at Kennedy's expense. That's where the mocking came in. 4 separate times she made remarks that highlighted inconsistencies or oversimplifications in Kennedy's phrasing. For example, when Kennedy tried to present a legal point using a folksy analogy, Judge Jackson countered with a crisp legal explanation that undercut the analogy entirely. The courtroom reacted, and Kennedy's expression said it all. He had been put on the spot. On another occasion, when Kennedy framed a question with broad generalizations, Jackson quipped back with a precise detail exposing the flaw. Each time the audience grew more engaged, some even laughing quietly at the exchanges. From the outside, it seemed like Judge Jackson was in control. For her supporters, it was proof of her intellect and presence. For Kennedy's, however, it looked like a setup, a situation where mockery might overshadow substance, but here's what many observers missed in real time. Kennedy wasn't rushing his responses. He wasn't throwing words back quickly or trying to out-joke the judge. Instead, he listened. He absorbed, and with each mock, he weighed the tone of the room. waiting for the right moment. That patience would prove critical later when he finally delivered his response. That flipped the courtroom mood. This background matters because it wasn't just two personalities clashing. It was two distinct approaches to public power. Judge Jackson leaned on precision confidence and sharp intellect to make her points land. Kennedy leaned on composure, timing, and restraint, all while letting the judge appear to have the upper hand for most of the exchange. This is also why the final response was so powerful. It wasn't born out of desperation or anger. It was carefully timed, perfectly delivered, and so unexpected that it changed the perception of the entire event. So, as we move forward, keep this context in mind. Judge Jackson's reputation for brilliance and sharp questioning, Kennedy's reputation for wit and resilience, and the courtroom setting where every word is amplified by the presence of witnesses, cameras, and national attention. The stage was set. The mockery had landed, and the audience believed they knew where the story was headed, but they didn't because the final twist was still waiting. The moment that set everything in motion wasn't loud at first. It began with a simple exchange, Kennedy asking a question he believed would highlight flaws in Judge Jackson's reasoning. He leaned forward calm but pointed, framing it in his signature plain-spoken style. The courtroom grew quiet. Every eye was on Jackson. And then, instead of a straightforward answer, she smiled. What followed was the first of 4 mocking responses that changed the tone of the room. Her reply was quick, laced with precision, but also framed with just enough sarcasm to land like a jab. The audience reacted instantly. A ripple of laughter swept across the courtroom. Kennedy paused, his expression steady, but inside the stage had shifted. What should have been a debate of ideas was now being framed as a duel of wit. The second instance came only minutes later. Kennedy pressed further this time, sharpening his phrasing, but Judge Jackson leaned back, delivered her counter, and again emphasized a flaw in his argument that seemed to belittle the approach. The crowd's reaction grew louder. By now, Kennedy wasn't just facing tough questioning. He was being made into the punchline. For observers watching live, it looked one-sided. PS quickly spread online, highlighting Jackson's confidence and Kennedy's silence. Social media took the short moments and ran with them, painting Kennedy as cornered. But what most missed was Kennedy's deliberate restraint. He wasn't fumbling. He wasn't unsure. He was waiting. The third mock was the sharpest. Kennedy raised a constitutional principle, citing examples. Jackson interrupted mid-thought with a technical correction. Accurate. Yes, but phrased in a way that drew chuckles from the back of the room. For the third time, Kennedy absorbed it. No raised voice, no visible frustration, just composure. By the fourth, it felt like a pattern. Jackson countered his analogy with such precision that the reaction bordered on applause. Kennedy adjusted his papers, leaned back, and simply nodded. The audience believed they had witnessed the senator outmatched. This was the breaking point. The scandal, as it would soon be framed, wasn't about legal theory alone, it was about optics. The clips of a sitting U.S. senator appearing to be mocked repeatedly by a Supreme Court justice were powerful and divisive. Supporters of Jackson claimed it showed brilliance under pressure. Critics argued it was disrespectful, undermining the seriousness of the setting. Media outlets seized the moment. Headlines painted it as Kennedy humiliated in open court. Commentators debated whether his style had finally met its match. For hours, the narrative ran one way. Kennedy had been silenced. But here's the part that changed everything. While the room and the headlines rushed to judgment, Kennedy was calculating. He'd let the 4 moments stack up. He allowed the perception of defeat to grow. And then at the moment when attention peaked, he delivered the response no one expected. That was the scandal, breaking the illusion of Kennedy being undone. In reality, he was setting the stage for a single powerful comeback that would leave the courtroom stunned. When the first headlines broke, they all carried the same message. Judge Jackson had outsmarted Senator Kennedy. Clips replayed her 4 mocking counters again and again. Each one framed as a knockout moment, but beneath the surface a very different story was building. Kennedy's style has always been underestimated. He speaks in plain language, but his questions are structured with precision. Every pause, every phrase is meant to corner his opponent logically. In this case, though it seemed as if Jackson had flipped the script, yet here's what most people missed. Kennedy wasn't responding immediately because he was gathering. He was stacking every remark, every correction, every moment of mockery into one ledger. Behind the scenes, transcripts of the exchange were released. Reading them without the audience's laughter or the dramatic framing of clips told a strikingly different tale. Yes, Jackson had mocked, but Kennedy's questions remained unanswered in full. Each time she sidestepped the central issue with wit but not depth. It was the kind of strategy that wins in sound bites but weakens under scrutiny. The escalation began when analysts dug deeper. Legal experts started comparing Kennedy's original line of questioning with Jackson's replies. In law, journals professors highlighted the gaps. Kennedy had raised constitutional principles, separation of powers, limits of interpretation, and those points had not been resolved. Instead, they were met with technical quips. That contrast mattered. It reframed the viral clips. What looked like a win in the moment began to appear shallow on closer inspection. Kennedy, aware of this, began preparing his follow-up. He waited until the public debate had reached its height. By now, the story wasn't just about a courtroom clash. It was about whether senators could challenge justices effectively or whether mockery and quick wit were enough to disarm serious arguments. The evidence escalated further when uncut footage surfaced. Longer recordings showed Kennedy's body language, steady, unshaken, deliberate. The pauses that some, framed as hesitation, looked in context like restraint. He wasn't flustered. He was patient. He was giving Jackson space, allowing her responses to take shape fully, knowing they would reveal themselves later, as thin news outlets began to shift. Commentators who had initially declared Jackson the winner started noting how Kennedy's silence wasn't weakness, but strategy. This was the second layer of escalation, perception shifting from humiliation to calculation. Then came Kennedy's decision to release his prepared documents. These weren't ordinary notes. They contained precedent rulings and constitutional citations that directly challenged Jackson's dismissive remarks. Each document lined up with a specific moment of mockery. One by one, they revealed that his questions had legal grounding, while her answers leaned more on rhetoric. For supporters of Kennedy, this was explosive. They argued it proved that Jackson's confidence came at the expense of substance. For critics, it was harder to dismiss than before. The evidence was there, written, sourced, undeniable. The final escalation came during his public response. In a carefully timed statement, Kennedy didn't raise his voice or use sharp insults. He simply laid out the evidence. 4 questions, 4 dismissive answers, and 4 documents showing why each of his points mattered. No exaggeration, no theatrics, just clarity. The courtroom moments that once looked like Kennedy's defeat now looked like a setup for something larger. He had given Jackson the space to mock him 4 times, and then revealed that each moment left her exposed. By the end of Act 2, the debate had flipped. What began as a story of Kennedy, humiliated, had escalated into evidence that Jackson's wit overshadowed substance. The audience was no longer laughing. They were waiting to see how Kennedy would deliver the final strike. By the time Kennedy released his carefully prepared documents, it was no longer just about him versus Judge Jackson. The exchange had pulled back the curtain on something much bigger. At first glance, this seemed like another courtroom clash. But when people looked closer, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Kennedy's evidence didn't just counter Jackson's remarks. It highlighted a deeper issue: how often sharp exchanges and sound bites replace substantive debate in high-stakes hearings. The public had been given entertainment instead of clarity. Kennedy's approach forced a question: if even one of the most visible hearings in the country can be reduced to a series of mock lines, what does that mean for ordinary cases that never make headlines? That was the system exposed. The documents he presented revealed a consistent pattern. Each time Jackson mocked, she skipped addressing the central principle. And each principle wasn't a minor technicality. It was about how the Constitution is interpreted, how much power a justice holds, and where those limits end. These weren't just Kennedy's points. They were foundational questions that affect every American citizen. When analysts mapped it out, the system looked less like an arena of accountability and more like a stage. Senators asked questions, justices offered witty dismissals, and the audience applauded or criticized, depending on politics. The danger was obvious. Substance drowned under spectacle. Kennedy's revelation shifted that perspective. He showed how spectacle hides what's missing: genuine accountability. By staying calm, by refusing to match wit with wit, he highlighted the gap between showmanship and seriousness. And when he dropped his evidence, that gap became undeniable. The media began reframing the narrative. Commentators started asking, how many times has this happened before? Old hearings were revisited. Clips of exchanges that once seemed clever were replayed with new scrutiny. The question became not whether Kennedy or Jackson won the exchange, but whether the entire process was broken. This was the system exposed a culture where sharp lines earn more headlines than thoughtful answers, where the loudest moment overshadows the most important point. Kennedy didn't stop there. He pointed out how citizens are the ones most affected when principles are brushed aside. When separation of powers isn't taken seriously, laws stretch further than intended. When constitutional limits are ignored, rights shift silently, and when hearings are treated as performances, the people lose trust in the very system meant to represent them. The weight of his words carried beyond the courtroom. Editorials noted that Kennedy had turned a personal exchange into a larger reckoning. He was no longer just a senator defending his questions. He was exposing how the system itself risks failing if substance doesn't return to the center. For many viewers, this was a wake-up call. The laughter that filled the courtroom earlier now seemed hollow. What good is a witty retort if it leaves the people's questions unanswered? Kennedy's calm response reframed those 4 moments of mockery as examples of something bigger, a culture of dismissiveness where the form matters more than the facts. By the end of Act 3, the story was no longer about Kennedy being mocked. It was about whether the nation could continue with a system that rewards cleverness over clarity. Kennedy had shown that what seemed like a personal clash was really a reflection of how deep the problem runs. The stage was set. The system had been exposed. Now the only question was, what would happen when Kennedy finally broke his silence fully in the most public way possible? That's where the turning point was waiting. The room was tense. For 4 rounds, Judge Jackson had kept the upper hand with quick dismissals and clever remarks. Each time the audience leaned toward her side. Each time Kennedy seemed to retreat into silence, and yet that silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. When he finally spoke, the shift was immediate. Kennedy began with a single sentence. "Judge, it's not me you're dismissing, it is the Constitution itself." The words landed like a hammer. No humor, no flourish, just direct and unmistakable. The audience, which had chuckled through earlier exchanges, fell quiet. Jackson, who had been sharp and confident, leaned back ever so slightly. The dynamic had changed. Instead of matching her tone, Kennedy slowed the pace. Each line was deliberate, almost surgical. He laid out one principle after another, connecting each of Jackson's earlier mock remarks to a specific constitutional issue she had sidestepped. Every point was backed with documentation, statutes, rulings, and written opinions. But Kennedy didn't just recite facts. He framed them as choices. If we ignore this precedent, what stops future courts from stretching beyond their authority? If we treat this clause as flexible, how long before rights guaranteed today can be redefined tomorrow? Each question forced listeners to consider consequences not in theory, but in real life. Then came the turning point. Kennedy paused, looked directly at the judge, and said, "Mock me if you must, but mockery doesn't erase evidence, and mockery doesn't protect the people who trust us to take these questions seriously." The courtroom was stunned. For the first time, the laughter was gone. The moment wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about accountability. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Jackson's confident smirk had faded into stillness. The power of Kennedy's final response wasn't in its volume. It was in its clarity. What made it unforgettable was how it reframed the entire exchange. Kennedy hadn't tried to win with a sharper line. He had risen above the sparring altogether, making her mockery look small compared to the weight of his evidence. Even critics acknowledged it. Commentators who had praised Jackson's wit earlier admitted that Kennedy's closing response was devastating. Not because it embarrassed her, but because it shifted the ground of the debate. It forced the public to ask, are we valuing clever moments more than constitutional truth? That was the climax, the laughter, the dismissals, the playful tone. All of it collapsed under the weight of a single unflinching statement. Kennedy had turned silence into strategy, and when he finally spoke, it was with the authority of someone who knew he was speaking not just for himself, but for the people watching across the nation. From that moment, the story changed. No longer was it about a senator being mocked. It was about a senator drawing a line in the sand, a line that said, accountability matters more than applause. The turning point was clear. Kennedy had transformed a courtroom spectacle into a moment of reckoning, and the entire system, from judges to senators to the audience at home, was left to face it. The aftermath of Kennedy's final words stretched far beyond the courtroom. What had started as an exchange of sharp remarks now became a catalyst for deeper reflection. Within hours, headlines focused less on Judge Jackson's earlier mockery and more on the moment Kennedy reframed the debate. Analysts on both sides noted that he had done something rare. He had pulled the conversation out of personality clashes and into principle. And that shift had consequence. Committees began revisiting the issues Kennedy raised. Several senators who had remained quiet during the exchange now pressed for clarity on constitutional boundaries that had long been blurred. What had once been treated as routine hearings suddenly felt weightier, with an urgency to restore credibility. For Judge Jackson, the exchange was a reminder that even the sharpest wit has limits when the subject turns serious, though she did not publicly admit fault. Her tone in later hearings noticeably changed. Humor gave way to measured explanations. Even her supporters acknowledged that Kennedy had forced the discussion onto firmer ground. But the impact reached far beyond the two of them. Ordinary citizens watching clips online began asking questions too. Social media threads weren't just replaying Jackson's quips. They were dissecting Kennedy's evidence. Teachers discussed the moment in civics classes. Law students analyzed it as an example of how tone and substance can collide in the courtroom. The larger system also responded. Proposals that had stalled for months found new momentum. Bipartisan interest grew around measures to ensure hearings stayed focused on constitutional accountability rather than personality contests. One senator remarked, "The public doesn't want a show, they want substance." This moment reminded us of that. It wasn't reform in the sweeping sense of new laws overnight, but it was reform in tone, in expectation, and in accountability. The exchange set a precedent that mockery, while entertaining, cannot overshadow responsibility. For Kennedy, the aftermath strengthened his reputation. He wasn't seen as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one who chose patience until it mattered. His restraint and eventual precision became a model for how to respond under pressure. For Jackson, the lesson was equally clear. Wit can command attention, but in the long run, clarity carries more weight. And for the public, this moment was a rare reminder of why debates matter in the first place. They aren't performances. They are opportunities to test ideas, challenge assumptions, and hold leaders accountable. By the end of this chapter, both sides had been reshaped. The court learned that tone must never outweigh truth. Legislators learned that the public is paying closer attention than they often assume. And the nation learned that even in the midst of sharp exchanges, a single moment of clarity can lead to change. Resolution didn't come through a dramatic verdict or sweeping legislation. It came through a recalibration, a subtle but important shift that reminded everyone involved that accountability is more powerful than applause. And in that sense, Kennedy's final words had already achieved reform. When the dust settled, 3 lessons stood out. First, words carry weight. Judge Jackson's sharp mockery may have entertained in the moment, but Kennedy's calm persistence reminded us that substance outlasts style. Second, patience is powerful. Kennedy didn't rush to respond after each remark. He waited until it mattered most, then delivered with precision. That restraint turned the exchange from a spectacle into a turning point. Third, accountability matters more than performance. The courtroom and the nation was reminded that hearings are not about applause lines or clever comebacks. They are about truth, integrity, and public trust. These lessons don't belong only to politicians or judges. They belong to us all. Every time we watch a debate, every time we cast a vote, every time we demand answers from those in power, we shape the tone of our democracy. So, here's the call to action: stay engaged. Don't settle for sound bites. Ask hard questions. Look for clarity over theatrics, and never underestimate the impact of persistence and principle, even when the odds seem stacked against them. As one commentator put it after the exchange, mockery fades, substance stays. That is the heart of this story. Kennedy's final response wasn't just about winning a moment in court. It was about restoring perspective, about showing that truth can stand tall even when surrounded by laughter, about reminding us that leadership is measured not by sharp words, but by steady ones. And as viewers, as citizens, as participants in democracy, we are called to carry that same standard forward, because in the end, every institution reflects the people it serves. If we demand integrity, we will get more of it. If we reward substance over spectacle, the system will follow. So let this moment be more than a story. Let it be a spark to value patience, a spark to seek truth, a spark to hold leaders accountable, not for how loudly they speak, but for how clearly they stand. Because, as Kennedy showed, sometimes the most stunning response is not the sharpest but the strongest.